So I'm very excited to introduce Sylvain Calinon from IDIAP. I know Sylvain for a long time. He's at IDIAP, he's leading the robot learning and interaction group. And before that, he was at IIT for a little bit, the Italian Institute of Technology. He got his PhD from EPFL with Aude Biard. He was a PhD student around the same time that I was, but he was more senior. And I remember sort of our lab learned what learning from demonstration is from his papers. We had read all of them and actually integrated some of his MATLAB code into some of our systems. And I hear he's still using MATLAB and making people adapt to him. But he's been very consistently working in this area of robot learning. I'm excited to see that interaction has become a bit more a part of it, which was the focus of our lab when we started using his work. And I'm excited to hear what he's going to tell us today.
Thank you very much, Maya, for the introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation. So yes, as you mentioned, so I come from IDIAP. IDIAP, it's a small research institute in Switzerland. It's located in Valais, and we are specialized in AI and machine learning. Here, currently, we have 14 research groups, all around the topic of AI and machine learning with different kind of data. And I created the robot learning and interaction group 7 years ago. We have a joint development plan with EPFL, so it means that our PhD students are also affiliated with EPFL. So we are specialized in the group in learning from demonstration, how to have robots that can acquire new skills by observing users and by interacting with persons. So what I like in this field is that there are many underlying challenges. First, it connects to a lot of other robot techniques, including planning, control, and perception. There are also various ways of acquiring data. We can learn by observing others. We can also learn by kinesthetic teaching or by teleoperation. And there are also a lot of correspondence problems, like a lot of mapping problems. We need to generalize what we have observed to new robots or to new situations. What I also like in this field of research is that it can be applied to industrial robots, and especially with the new types of robots that we see now as Industry 4.0 robots or as cobots. But we can also apply it to a wide range of other robots applications. And here it includes a very wide range with robots that are close to us, with assistive robots, with robots that are parts of us when we think about prosthetic arms or prosthetic legs, and also robots that are far away from us when we think about robots that we need to teleoperate and that need to teleoperate from distance. And in all of these applications, we can have these robots acquiring some skills by demonstration, and we need strong generalization demands in the sense that we need these robots to adapt to new environments, to new persons, and to new users. So when we think of learning, when we think of machine learning, my argument will be that in robotics, we have a very different kind of machine learning problem. We have data, but we usually have only few data. And it happens that we cannot have systems that can be fed with a huge amount of data, and we cannot always rely on this huge amount of data when we want to acquire some skills. So in this presentation, I will show some of the research lines that we are conducting in our group to try to reduce this amount of data that are required for a robot to learn new skills. And I will have different parts in my presentation, presenting different kinds of structures that we can exploit to have these robots learning faster or with fewer amount of data. So I will go from a high level to a low level structure by first discussing the different learning strategies that we can use. I will then discuss movement primitives. I will then talk about geometric structures that we can employ. And finally, I will end up with maybe the lowest level with the way we can organize data structures. So that will be the outline of my presentation. So for the first part, my takeaway message is that it's not only machine learning when we are talking about robotics, because we have this interaction aspect. So even if we have few data, the good point is that we can get better data if we build systems that can acquire this data in an efficient way. And when we can have targeted data for what the robot has to learn with its current understanding about the task. So here we can talk about machine teaching, we can talk about active learning, about curriculum learning, but more generally, we have this interaction aspect that I believe we should exploit as much as possible to acquire better data. I like also to view the learning problem as a scaffolding problem. So meaning that the robot first need a lot of support. So in the same way as this house would need a lot of scaffolds at the beginning in order to be constructed. But once the construction has progressed, we can progressively remove the scaffolds. And at the end, we would like this house to stand on its own. And for a robot, it's similar. First, maybe we need a lot of interaction. Maybe we need to show a lot of different aspects. But progressively, we would like a robot to acquire some autonomy. And if everything worked well, to have this robot being autonomous later. Then the nice aspect is that we also have many different kinds of learning modalities that we can exploit in robotics. There is currently a high spotlight on the reinforcement learning aspects, but here I would argue that combining different types of learning strategies would be the most beneficial, especially because by combining these different strategies, we can actually simplify each individual strategy. So we can, for example, use more simple algorithm for each of the strategy if we have a better way of combining these different learning strategies. So it's some form of meta-learning problem where we would like to have the robot also deciding what kind of strategies it should use, or the user deciding if she or he would like to provide demonstrations at this time, or to stop the robot in order to correct some part of the movement. It's also about scaffolding the environment. So it's also about putting the robot in a context that will help the robot at acquiring the task more easily. And also different forms of learning by demonstration. So here, if we think about imitation learning, there is not only a single way of imitating someone else. We can either imitate the goal, but we can also imitate the low-level actions. So for each of these single learning modality, there are also different options that we can use and that we can combine in order to speed up the learning process. So that's what we are interested in at a, let's say, high-level structure of learning. Then we are also interested in the technological aspect, how to build mechanisms to provide these demonstrations in an efficient way. There are many when we talk about learning from demonstration. We can teleoperate the robot and acquire data through this teleoperation. We can use kinesthetic teaching. We can, of course, use vision by having the robot observing someone doing a movement. Or we can use something that is intermediary. So with robots, if we think about interfaces, there are the standard teaching pendants that are these bulky interfaces that are often used with industrial robots. On the other side, there are interfaces that can also be bulky in the sense that if the user needs to wear, for example, a virtual reality headset, it might not be the most convenient way for the user to provide demonstrations. So for this reason, we are interested in something intermediary that is related to augmented reality, and that is basically to use mobile phones, to use smartphones and to have augmented reality applications that are displaying a virtual robot, that is allowing the user to use the interface to turn around the workspace of the robot and to monitor what is happening. So the idea here is to use that either to program the robot or to monitor what is happening. So to add extra information on top of the interface in order to help the user. So here in this video, we have the robot in the middle being a virtual robot. We first program the virtual robot, and then we run the program on the real robot that is on the side. So that's for the, let's say, technological aspect that we are studying in terms of the interface. Now, the most part of our work is related to the representation aspect, so to the models to use in order to represent movements and skills in general, and how to have models that are compact and that can generalize to new situations. So behind this, there is this notion of movement primitives that is used a lot in robotics. That is a way to combine different bricks of movements. And these bricks can be combined either in series or in parallel in order to build a skill that is the more elaborated skill. So when we talk about combination, sometimes we can think of combination as just summing different things. And here I will just use this toy example to show you a way to compute the crossing of these two segments in a manner that I would not recommend. So one way to do this would be to take each segment separately and to shrink the information so that we say that on average, when I'm on this segment, on average, I'm on this point. That would be my my way of compressing the data so that this segment is collapsing to a point. Now, if I'm doing it the same way with the other segment, I have this point, and then the bad way of computing the crossing between these two segments would be to say that we take the average of these 2 points. So here with this toy example, it looks completely stupid to do it in this way. But my point is that many times we are doing that in robotics. And we are doing that when this point here is representing something more complicated. So when we have a model that has much more dimension, or that is a problem that is much more complicated, we will often compact it to a single solution, and we will later use this solution together with another solution. And very often we will just make a weighted sum of this, and sometimes even just a sum or an average of this. While here, the correct solution would be to take this point, obviously. So now behind that, there is actually a probabilistic interpretation. Instead of thinking of segments, we can think of Gaussians. And here the segments was actually a Gaussian that was close to singularity. So now if we think of Gaussians, our problems look like this. We would like to be close to the center, but with some weight that is this time a full weighting matrix. And this full weighting matrix, that we can also call a precision matrix, is related to this uncertainty information. So here the precision is the inverse of a covariance. And when we solve such kind of problem, we are just solving an optimization problem with a series of quadratic error terms, but that are weighted with full precision matrices. And here, if we solve that, the solution is an analytical solution. It looks like a weighted sum of the mu, but it's a weighted sum with full weight matrices. So here it's important to make this distinction when we are talking about primitives in general. So it can be movement primitives, but also controller primitives, is to combine this in a way so that we exploit this uncertainty information or this variation information. Because very often when we combine these simple bricks, very often each simple brick has variations that we can exploit. So if we lose this variation too early in our process, then we cannot combine them efficiently. So here, this whole part of my presentation will be using this. And using this in various ways. So the Gaussians will have different shapes, dimensions will be different. And there will be a special case, that is this one, where we have isotropic Gaussian, where here I can make the weighted sum. It is the only case where I can do that. Now, one aspect that I find also relevant is that if you look at this problem, but at the limit case, so when you have one Gaussian being close to singularity, and the other Gaussian being isotropic, this product of Gaussians boils down to a projection operation. And here what is relevant is that there is a direct link with null space projection operation. So it means that by considering a product of Gaussians, and if we look at the whole range of options, we can cover the standard weighted superposition with scalar weights, but we can also cover null space projection, which means hierarchy constraints. After, of course, we need to be careful about the way we compute that in terms of the numerical computation problem, but the principle remains interesting. Okay, so now let's look at what people do in other fields that are not movement primitives or learning from demonstration. So this, it's typically applied in everyday work when you are using a Kalman filter. When we use a Kalman filter, there is also this fusion of different sources of information. One source of information comes from the model. One source of information comes from a sensor, and we can, of course, combine multiple sensors. And here again, when we have this kind of problem, the correct way of fusing these different sources of information is to compute a product, so to take this point instead of just taking the average of the data that we collect. So for perception or Kalman filtering, it's well known. But my argument is that we should use this more when we talk about movement primitives and controller primitives. So when we combine different controllers, we can use exactly the same principle if we have this controller being represented as a distribution. So in the most simple case, as a Gaussian distribution, in this case, we talk about product of Gaussians. But in more general case, we can talk about product of experts, where here the distribution doesn't necessarily need to be a Gaussian. Then ideally, we would also like to move a bit away from the time aspect of movement primitives. Very often when we talk about movement primitives, there is some notion of time. But in many cases, we don't want to use time, at least not explicitly. But we still need this combination as bricks that we put together to create a more complex scheme. So here we are also putting the consideration of behavior primitives instead of movement primitives, which are building blocks of time independence. So let me show you one first work that we did in this direction. So here we took as an inspiration the standard dynamical movement primitives, or DMP, and we tried to dissect the different parts of a DMP model. So basically, a DMP model has two parts, with one part being a spring damper system that is specified as the system that will have the nice property, the equilibrium point, and the attraction behavior that we want to reach a desired point. This system is a state-based system, and we add on top of this, with a scalar superposition, a time-based or phase-based behavior that are forcing terms that will perturb the system and that will allow us to follow some demonstration. So usually it's not time being explicit, it's a phase variable, but the phase variable is related to time. So now what we will do is to also exploit a mechanism where we define some part of the system and where we learn some other part of the system. But this time we will use this in a more generic way. First, we will use this fusion operation that I talked about before. So we will see that with full weighting matrices instead of scalars. And then we will enable to have not only spring damper system, but other conservative systems that we would like our robot to follow. And here, typically, what we do here is to use optimization techniques that are related to linear quadratic regulators or variants around this, that is allowing us to have gains that are varying along the task to be fulfilled. So it means that we can have an attractive behavior that is different at the beginning of the task or at the end of the task. Now, this part of the policy will be quite conventional. It will be to copy what we have observed as demonstration. So here we will have an imitation policy that could not solve the problem alone, but when we combine it with this part, we have a mechanism that is very similar to the standard DMP, but this time with two state-based system, and that corresponds to a product of policies. So here it means that we have some behavior at the beginning of the movement that can evolve until the end of the movement. And we tested that in various applications and in various state spaces. So it includes the joint angle space, task space, the use of forces. We also tried with different task spaces, such as pixel spaces in this example, by having a small part of the data being used to learn the mapping between the task space and the pixel space. And here, when we have such formulation after, what is interesting to have is that if we move the object, we have an automatic correction of the movement with respect to this change. Another example along this line is to investigate if we can use these policies with different modes. So far, I was talking about policies with some variations around these policies, but very often the variations are not unimodal. We can sometimes have different ways that are clearly distinct to do a task. So here it's what we did in this experiment by demonstrating several modes. And each mode has its own amount of variations that are allowed to fulfill the task. And then during the reproduction, the idea is that the robot has to switch between these different modes in a very fast way. So it means that we need to be really reactive depending on what happens, and to also exploit the variations for each of these tasks. So it's an experiment we did in this case by using markers. And now we would like to combine the two work all together. Now, I would like also to show a second way of fusing different sources of information to move the robot. And now we talk about planning problems. And I will use a very simple model that is the linear quadratic tracking model, which is an optimization problem with two parts. One is a cost function that relates to the tracking of a path. So we would like to reduce an error between our system and the target with some precision matrix. And at the same time, we would like to do that with small control commands. So in some way, we would like to use the minimum effort possible to do the task. And then we describe as well the evolution of our system. So if we take the most simple system that can be solved in this way, to, for example, say that we have a point mass system, but we will control it with some acceleration commands. But this system here will be just a double integrator. And that our goal is to reach some target at the end of the movement with some precision matrix that is specified. So that's really like the standard textbook example of this LQT or LQR problem. And then what this system will do is to compute a series of control commands in order to bring our system to the target after some time steps. So here, when we solve this kind of problem, the difference between what I was presenting before is that we have some time window. We have an objective function that is running over a time window. But I think that it's interesting to note that since we have a cost function that is composed of quadratic error term, Another way to view the resolution of the problem is to treat it as a product of Gaussians. And indeed, it's possible to show that this part can be expressed as a Gaussian, but this time it's a Gaussian with many variables because it's a Gaussian that is taking into account all of the time steps in the trajectory. This Gaussian is representing the most efficient way to track the target without considering the command, which would give a point here together with a precision matrix. This part, the way to solve it is just a zero command. It's the minimum effort that you can find, so not moving is the solution for this one. And then the trade-off that is often described in a LQR problem can also be computed as a product of Gaussians. So by computing the intersection of these two Gaussians, we get the result of the LQR problem, and we also get the variations around this center. And this interpretation is helpful if we want to combine these well-established control strategies and planning strategies with representations that comes from statistics or from machine learning or related to movement primitive. And one example that we use in our group is to view the movement as a set of Gaussians that we need to reach. The Gaussians can be either key point or they can be part of the trajectory that we would like to model. And here, by modeling this in this way, and by also modeling the transition probabilities between these different Gaussians, then we can generate a reproduction behavior that will follow the demonstrations and that will exploit the variations in order to do this. So in this example, what the system is reproducing will exploit the fact that we add variations in our. Now, what we are currently investigating is to move this quadratic problem into a locally quadratic problem. So here in control or in optimization, we talk about ILQR or DDP. When we talk about smaller time window, we can talk about MPT. But these principles also apply to these settings, but this time locally. Now, very often when we talk about movements, we need to relate the movements to objects. And here again, the product of Gaussians is a very useful interpretation of this, because it means that we can associate the movements with respect to multiple objects or multiple landmarks that can be useful for the task, and then compute the trade-off as a product of Gaussian. So here it's exactly what you see in this animation. We have a movement associated to this shoe that will be displayed in red, or in blue, I think. You have another movement that is associated to the robot coordinate system. Here we have two coordinate systems, and the fusion of the two is displayed here in yellow. And this is the mixture of Gaussians that we will use to apply LQR and reproduce a path that is taking into consideration different coordinate systems. Here I will briefly mention this project where we used the same technique. The project is called DexRov. It's about teleoperating an underwater bimanual robot. I won't have time to go into the details, but I wanted to highlight that we can also use this product of Gaussians when we talk about teleoperation. Here with teleoperation, it means that the user will control some part, and we will have some assistance for the user that can be set at a local level that can help the user typically to align tools with local elements of the environment. So the typical example is to turn valve, or when you use a tool and the tool needs to be perpendicular to a surface, you don't necessarily need the teleoperator to show this, but you have a local controller that will automatically adapt the orientation of the tool with respect to the environment. So that's the way we use this technique in this project. Another potential way of exploiting this is to remove the teleoperation aspect, but to keep the user working together with the robot. And here we often talk about virtual fixtures when we do this, or about shared control in general. Here it means that the user is in contact with the robot, the user is showing or is using the robot as a tool, but instead of having the robot being fully gravity compensated, we constrain the movement so that the user can move it only in some directions. And this kind of constraints can be quite varied. It can be to have the robot staying on the plane, to have the robot keeping desired orientation, pointing at an object, or keeping some distance from an object. And here it can also be viewed as some expert behaviors that we want to combine together with what the user is doing. More recently, we have been investigating this in the context of bilateral teleoperation. In this case, what is challenging is that we don't only want to have a teleoperating device on a robot reproducing what we teleoperate on the other side, but we would like to have the communications that is going both ways. We would like our user to also be able to feel what the robot is feeling on the other side. We are interested in this setting because it can be used both for the teleoperation of distant robot, but also in a sim-to-real problem, in the sense that this part here could be a user showing something to the robot in a simulation. And as we all know, when we're simulating robot, we will miss some aspect, and typically the object might not be simulated correctly, or there might be mismatch between this environment and this environment. So here in this case, we have put a very different environment. So we have put valves that are placed at with very different orientation and positions. And what we wanted to see in this work is if we could use a mapping that would map the two spaces and that would allow this teleoperator to do the task by ignoring what is happening on the other side in terms of mismatch with mapping. And here we used a very similar way of combining policies, but this time through different. Now, you remember when I was telling at the beginning that the product of Gaussians in the limit case is related to a projection operator. This works for Gaussians, but this can also be studied in a more generic way by thinking of product of experts with some levels of hierarchies. So maybe as an example, I will give this animation. Imagine that these are the observations, and we want to learn something out of these observations. First, we have an object that is far away from the user. We just collect the distance from the object to the end of the user. We might not understand the task very well. Now, if we are aware that there is another point of interest in this task, is to have this robot self-balancing. And if we are aware that the person here needs to self-balance and reach this object, so when we are aware of this, then we understand that reaching the arm fully is the best thing that this person can do. So if we observe that, even if there is a distance between the two, we do something smarter than a statistical analysis of just of just taking the average that we observe between these distances, we take into account the constraint in order to learn the task. And I think that's something that is important to note here, is that sometimes we cannot learn these bricks of movement separately. Sometimes we need to learn all together, or we need to be aware of the constraints in order to learn this efficiently. So this is what we investigated in these two works. We took this example of a robot that needs to keep a tray horizontal, and it needs to bring some object to a user as a secondary constraint. So here, what is important is not to spill the bottle. If possible, the robot should bring the bottle close to the other robot. The other robot here is representing. And with this approach, we could show that by considering a product of experts, we could have a robot that learned that the tray needs to be horizontal, that it needs to move the object toward the other robot's end, but also that the first task is more important than the second. Meaning that if it is in a situation where it cannot fulfill both, then it will prioritize one over the other. Okay, so now we'll talk about another form of structures that we are interested in and that I believe can be exploited to try to reduce the number of demonstrations that we need. That is related to Riemannian geometry. It's a field we didn't know about before a few years ago, but now we realized the importance of it, especially because in robotics, we have a lot of geometric structures that can be exploited. And if we understand this formalism, what is nice is you can move from one manifold to another by reusing the same tools. So that's something that is interesting in practice, is that we work on a problem that can be related to orientation, but by working on this problem, we actually have tools to solve another problem that can be to work with manipulability ellipsoids. So here, let me first highlight some of the manifolds in robotics that we can consider. So rigid body motions, orientation, directions, can be related to mixing coefficients. We have a lot of symmetric positive definite matrices. They can take varied forms. They can be covariances, like covariance features, for example, for sensing information. It can be ellipsoids. With ellipsoids, there are like manipulability, stiffness, inertia, centroidal momentum. You can also consider gains, graph Laplacians, kernels. So we have a lot of objects that are in this manifold, and it might be interesting to consider this structure instead of having a general problem working in Euclidean space and only later on adapting it to fulfill the constraints of the manifold. Here with Riemann geometry, everything is done by exploiting the structure of the manifold. We also have hyperbolic manifolds that can be used for trees, graphs, networks, or subspaces. Here it can relate to the null space projection operators I mentioned, or to planes or lines that we would like to detect in the robot environment. So for all of this type of structure, there will be a common mechanism that is to consider that at each point on the manifold, there will be some tangent space. If we think here of a sphere, a tangent space would be the plane that is touching that is making the contact with the sphere. So we use this illustration here to simplify, but it can be extended to the other manifolds I presented. And then what we need in Riemannian manifold is a way to map some vector that is in the tangent space to some point on the manifold. We call this path here a geodesic. That will be the closest path to move from this point to this point. And here I have the corresponding Schrödinger vector in the tangent space. So the very first tool in Riemannian manifold is to have a mapping function that is allowing us to compute how to map this vector to this manifold. It's called exponential mapping and logarithmic mapping. It's a bit the same as the problem of having to represent a path on a globe map, all of the distortions that it includes. And here the tangent space is making an approximation locally that will allow us to do. So only with exponential mapping and logarithmic mapping, we can already do quite a lot. We can do interpolation on Riemannian manifolds. We can do clustering on Riemannian manifolds by having a mixture of Gaussians that can adapt to these different geometries. Now, if we want to move a step further with some control techniques or with some regression techniques, we need a second tool, and it's the only one, the only two tools that we really need for many problems. It's called parallel transport. On parallel transport, I have an animation to show briefly what it is. When we are following a geodesic, our tangent space will rotate while following the geodesic. And the problem we have with this is that if we specify a vector, this vector will turn. And it's not something that we are used in Euclidean space, because in Euclidean space, if I'm defining a vector, I can apply it to any other point. So here with Riemann manifolds, we will have to correct this rotation here. And to correct it, we have this parallel transport operation. And with all the manifolds I presented, this is actually a very simple operation. It's something that is also analytical, so it's something that is coded with many manifolds. It's actually just a linear operation. So with this, we have a way to reuse a vector that was defined at some point on the manifold to another point on the manifold. This is that is required if you want to do regression or control tasks. So this is one of the study that we have conducted by using symmetric positive definite manifolds, and more particularly manipulability ellipsoids. In this case, the idea was to exploit this form of data to transfer skills from users to different forms of robots. Instead of transferring only the movement, we were transferring this manipulability aspect. And manipulability ellipsoids is a richer representation than manipulability indices. And in this work, we show the advantages of using this structure. So the last point in my presentation, the one being maybe the one with the at low level, is related to data structures. So one of the simplest form to decompose the data is the singular value decomposition, or PCA. And it's a tool that we use all the time. Sometimes it's only one tiny part of a complete algorithm. Sometimes it's the algorithm in itself, but it's something we need to use all the time. What happens with our data in robotics is that very often they are not formed as matrices or vectors. Since we have many sensors, we have sensors that are arrays of sensors. We often have problems that are over time windows, multiple coordinate systems. So very often the way we store our data will be in the form of tensor. And there is a field called tensor methods that is not the same as the name tensor being used in deep learning. It's related, but it's not the same. That is a simpler problem. It's to change this singular value decomposition problem so that it can be used with arrays of higher dimensions. So it means that if we store our data in this form, instead of having to reshape the data so that it's used as vector matrices, we keep the original form. And if we do that, we can also do some linear decomposition. It's just that the structure is richer, so there are different ways of decomposing that. Here, these are different names that exist to decompose that and to compress this information to extract what is most important. So in some way, it's a low-rank representation of a tensor. We are exploring that in various ways, but one way we have realized that it was a very useful technique is the problem of ergodic control. Ergodic control is a problem where we give as input a distribution that we would like our robot to track. So the standard tracking problem, we give only a point and we would like our robot to go there. In ergodic control, we give a distribution and the robot needs to search this area or to wander this area by making sure that it will reproduce the same distribution. And this mechanism, I will not go into the details, but to do that, we need Fourier series, and we need Fourier series that are spatial Fourier series. So it means that it's expansion in all directions. So if we have a 3D problem, we will have 3D tensors. And the problem quickly grows, and here we need some low-rank representation to be able to do that in more than 2D or 3D. And here the tensor methods were very helpful to that, and we demonstrated this in this insertion task, where here we provide the location as a distribution, and then we have the robot moving within this distribution in order to. Okay, so as a summary of my presentation, so the takeaway message that I wanted to convey is first that we should exploit multiple learning modalities, and that if we do that, we can reduce the complexity of each learning strategy. But we should not only consider movement primitives, but also behavior primitives, and exploiting variations. And there are various forms of variations to be exploited. Variations about the task, variations related to uncertainties. That we should also exploit multiple coordinate systems. Here I showed quite simple coordinate systems, but we can think of more elaborated coordinate systems in order to adapt to new situations in a more efficient way. And finally, to try to see what kind of prior knowledge we can put to our system in order to have the robot learning from only few demonstrations or few exploration trials in the environment. So these are the persons in the robot learning and interaction group, the current collaborators, past collaborators, and also the persons from the development team at IDIAP who is helping us with our work. If you would like to try the techniques that I presented, there are source codes here. The videos are on my personal webpage. I would also like to thank the support from the Swiss National Science Foundation and European Commission who funded this work. And while answering questions, I will just let this video run.
Thank you, Sylvain. Any questions? Feel free to unmute or write in the chat.
I have a question if I may get started. Two related things or quick questions actually. So you mentioned in this bilateral teleoperation, right, that I guess it's of course more natural for someone to interact with this robot to control the other robot versus doing it in virtual reality or so. But I can imagine that requires that you can replicate a physical environment that is very similar to the one in the target robot space. Do you think that VR might make that aspect at least easier, or what are your thoughts on that?
So when we did this work, I would say we jumped back and forth to real challenges or sim to real challenges, and we were not entirely sure which one is ideal. If we talk about the bilateral aspect, it's very good to have two robots on the two sides, because we know we can get the feedback we would need, and if we have the same robot, it's ideal because we don't need to scale these different behavior. In sim to real scenarios, it's less clear if we need this bilateral aspect, especially for the force aspect. So I guess it really depends on the kind of device we are using. So if it's really like the full virtual reality environment with force feedback, then yes, but otherwise it might be only unilateral in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's. Sorry, go ahead.
But the diffeomorphism is helping in the two cases.
Yeah. And of course, the force feedback is a big question that so I guess you don't want to depend on being able to really get the force feedback in your VR setting as well, right? Because it's really difficult to set up. So at the end, you mentioned these coordinate systems, right? And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how users should specify kind of what coordinate system is relevant for a certain task or so, right? Because there are all these different choices. And I guess it's not easy, especially for a novice, to specify what they care about or what should transfer from one demonstration to another one.
So here what we are currently investigating is that when we have multiple objects, there are different ways of attaching coordinate systems to this object. So it's not only about knowing how the movement relates to the object, it's also knowing how we create a coordinate system out of this object. And here there are indeed many ways to do that. So in this example, it's just a Cartesian coordinate system that we attach to it. We pre-specify the way we attach to it. So it's also something that that is like some structure that we pre-specified. What we noticed is that we should not use only Cartesian coordinate systems here because of the symmetries of the object. Typically, if here you would have, let's say, a bottle that you want to grasp, it's more efficient if you are considering a cylindrical coordinate system, for example, because it means that the way you acquire the data is also taking into account the symmetry of the object. So I guess there are many, here it's a very first step, but there are many different things I'm sure that can be investigated in this direction by changing the number of objects, but also the coordinate systems.
Thank you.
Also related to that, going from full objects versus object parts, right? You could think of like the shoe having multiple coordinate frames attached to it, and the motions being relative to those could lead to more generalizability of like different size shoes or different types of shoes, etc.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. Here I considered only a rigid body object, but yeah, you're right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I have a question maybe. I think in your experiments, you have markers and things on the objects and so on. How much of an issue do you think it is to scale to real perceptual data and trying to do it data efficiently? Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are there.
So we didn't have the chance to do it yet. What we hope is that since we have a representation that can exploit uncertainty, we hope we can also exploit uncertainty that would come from the perception system. After probably the challenge we will face is the one discussed by Maya, is if we have only part based of an object, can we reuse only this part based as coordinate system, and can we combine also different controllers but that are attached to only part of the object I think it's one of the challenge we will have to study.
I have a couple questions. I'll ask one and then see if others ask. But so you showed the virtual fixtures, which was maybe the slide after this. What was the role of learning in that case? So you mentioned you had two examples of like maintaining orientation that's relative to an object while it's being moved, and keeping a certain distance from an object was another. Is that those types of constraints, do you imagine them being extracted from demonstrations, or have you thought of ways users, like people, could specify those constraints and what kind of interface it would be?
I would say both. So some of the constraints can be specified, really built by hand as a controller that we activate, and others can be learned from demonstration. Another way is to also view this as a dictionary. So it's also possible to have a dictionary of possible constraints, and then the demonstrations are here only to pick up in the dictionary which element looks the most relevant. This is a way maybe to avoid having to, if you need to demonstrate to the robot how to stay within a plane, it can actually be difficult. You can introduce mistakes, and it might be helpful if the robot can also correct this mistake, and the dictionary can be maybe the helpful for that.
I see. Yeah, that could relate to the manifold work. Also, like figuring out which manifold is active in the demonstration. So my last question is kind of more high level. In the beginning part of the talk, you mentioned these different ways of learning, right? So from, imitating different parts or exploring with scaffolding. What do you see? And then, you've presented different pieces of work that have some overlap, but also distinctions. Like, what do you see as the bigger framework where all of these can be in one system?
So the impression that I have is a lot of groups, including ourselves, like we specialize in one learning strategy.
Yeah.
And when we do that, what happens is that since we are using this single learning strategy, then the problem is complex. And we can continue forever, because the problem with a single learning strategy will be extremely tough. And sometimes I have the impression that if we would instead view it as a meta learning problem, but we would not need this extra layer of complexity for each individual strategy, but that it's the orchestration of these different strategy that can be helpful. And that can also maybe be more adaptive, because it means as well that if the robot cannot learn by reinforcement learning, then it can ask for help from the user, or vice versa. If the demonstrations are not good enough, then we can use self-refinement in order to refine these tasks.
I see. Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah. So they don't have to be unified in one thing. They can remain different as long as we know how to switch between them. Thanks so much, Sylvain. That was really great.